Right now, the Russian army is still suffering enormous losses in Ukraine, and every single meter of Ukrainian land costs the Kremlin hundreds of soldiers, and the price continues to rise, because month after month Russia is paying in blood and the situation is getting harder to hide. Because at this point, estimates suggest that between 25 and 30,000 Russian soldiers are being killed or taken out of combat every single month. And while these numbers are already extreme, what really matters is what comes next, because Ukraine is now preparing for a phase of the war where Russian losses could increase even further. And that is because Kyiv has given its army a new main task. Ukraine is no longer focused primarily on quick territorial gains. Instead, the goal is to wear Russians down as much as possible, step by step, until its ability to fight collapses. And the focus of the Ukrainian defense leadership is now very clear, because Ukraine is openly aiming to push Russian losses to around 50,000 soldiers per month. But why Kyiv has shifted its focus so strongly toward Russian losses, how such numbers could realistically be reached, and what this could mean for the future of the war, that is exactly what we are going to take a closer look at today. Hi, my name is Alexander Korton. I'm a strategic analyst and media manager from Austria, and I'm also the founder of the German YouTube channel Geopol. And today we want to take a closer look about the Russian combat losses in Ukraine. If we look more closely at the current state of the Russian army in Ukraine, the picture is frankly disastrous, because Russian forces are struggling to capture new territory, and when they do attack, they often suffer massive losses for very small gains. And what stands out even more is the imbalance, because Russia is losing far more soldiers than Ukraine in many sectors, and in areas like Kupiansk, reports suggest that loss ratios have reached extreme levels, with dozens of Russian soldiers being lost for every Ukrainian defender. And around Pokrovsk, Ukrainian forces have also managed to inflict heavy losses while keeping their own casualties comparatively low. And these numbers are not isolated cases. They show a broader pattern that has been developing over months, and Russian attacks continue, but they become more costly and less effective over time. And the bad news for the Russian soldiers is now Kyiv is not satisfied with the current numbers, and Ukrainian leadership believes that even higher Russian losses are possible, and the message to Ukrainian forces has been very direct and clear. Because recently, Ukraine's new defense minister Mikhailo Fedorov made headlines by outlining a clear and uncompromising goal. The focus is no longer on retaking individual cities as quickly as possible. The focus is now on breaking the fighting strength of the Russian army itself. And in simple terms, the aim is to push Russian losses to a new level where the system can no longer sustain them. And Ukrainian officials have pointed out that recent months already saw tens of thousands of Russian casualties, and that these losses are closely tracked through battlefield evidence. And the conclusion in Kyiv is that Russia is beginning to face real shortages because it treats manpower as a resource, and this resource is being chained. And at first glance, this approach sounds brutal, but from Ukraine's point of view, it may be the only realistic option left, because Ukraine is currently not in a position to launch a massive and wide front offensive that would force Russia to surrender. And there are two main reasons for this. First, Ukraine does not have unlimited manpower or equipment, and second, such an offensive would almost certainly lead to very high Ukrainian losses, something Kyiv cannot afford given its current personnel situation. So Ukraine has to choose a different path, a path where success that is not colored by how much land changes on the map is achieved, but by how much Russia's ability to continue the war is here reduced over time. And as harsh as it sounds, human lives are treated as resources by the Kremlin. That is the reality inside the Russian army, and Ukraine is facing a situation where it has only two options left: allow its own people to be killed, or stop the Russian army by destroying its ability to fight. And we can now say Ukraine has chosen the second option. because even today the losses Russia is suffering are barely sustainable, because while Russia officially met its recruitment targets in 2025, it's because of early 2025, and since then the situation has changed. Because since July 2025, the Russian losses on the front line increased while recruitment numbers began to fall. And this means that the overall combat strength of the Russian army has been declining steadily in the last few months. And if Ukraine succeeds in pushing Russian losses even higher, this decline could accelerate very quickly. Because if Russian losses were to reach around 50,000 per month, while recruiting stays at roughly 25,000, Russia would effectively lose another 25,000 soldiers every month without replacement. And over 4 months, that would mean a loss of around 100,000 soldiers, over 8 months 200,000 soldiers, and over a year 300,000 soldiers. And this is assuming recruitment does not fall even further due to financial pressure or declining motivation. So basically, if Ukraine managed to reach these levels, it would lay the foundation for a major military shift on the front line, because by the end of the year, Russia could lose hundreds of thousands of soldiers without being able to replace them, and that would dramatically change the balance of forces along the front line. And at that point, Ukraine could eventually find itself with more available troops at the front line than Russia, and this is creating conditions where its own offensive would finally become a realistic and effective scenario. But there's also one critical condition, because Ukraine must keep its own losses as low as possible in the meantime. Because there is no advantage in inflicting heavy losses on Russia if Ukraine destroys its own army in the process. That is why Kyiv is increasingly relying on drones, long-range strikes and standoff weapons. Because these systems allow Ukraine to hit Russian forces while reducing the risk to Ukrainian soldiers. And exactly this approach has already shown results. Because throughout 2025, Russian losses continued to rise, while Ukraine managed to significantly reduce its own casualties. And Ukrainian military leadership has stated that losses among Ukrainian forces dropped noticeably compared to previous years, showing that Russia can be worn down without equal losses on the Ukrainian side. And all this leads to a very important point. The war today is not about capturing as much territory as possible, it is about minimizing Ukrainian losses while maximizes Russian losses. And this means we need to stop looking only at maps and assuming that every Russian advance is a success. Because if an army needs 2 years and loses hundreds of thousands of soldiers to capture a small town in the southern Donbass, that is not a victory. This is a military disaster for the Russian Federation. And Ukraine can afford to lose ground temporarily if every Russian advance comes at a high cost. And whether Pokrovsk or Konstantinivka changes hands in a few months is less important than how many Russian soldiers are lost in trying to take these cities. So Ukraine's task is to make sure that every Russian assault runs into what is essentially a wall of death, that well may move back slightly at times, but as long as it holds, Russia continues to bleed. But this brings us to an important question, because Ukraine has announced new offensive actions for this year, for 2026. And how does that fit with a strategy that focuses only on attrition? And it's right, at first glance this may seem contradictory, but it makes sense once we understand what kind of offensive operations Ukraine is talking about. Because Ukraine is not planning massive large-scale attacks like in the early phases of the war, like 2022. Concentrating huge amounts of troops and equipment for a broad breakthrough would be extremely dangerous and likely disastrous for Ukraine right now. Instead, Kyiv is focusing on limited local offensive operations. These are designed to isolate Russian units, disrupt supply lines and destroy forces using drones and precision strikes in the background. And such operations may not free large areas of the Ukrainian land, and in the best case they might retake smaller towns, but they serve two critical purposes. First, they further increase Russian losses, and secondly, they allow Ukraine to maintain the initiative. Because if Ukraine stopped attacking completely, Russia could control the tempo of the war, and Moscow could leave parts of the front lightly defended and concentrate large forces wherever it wants to attack. But limited Ukrainian offensive prevent that, because they force Russia to spread its resources along the entire front line and remain on constant alert, because any weakness could be exploited immediately by Ukrainian armed forces. So yes, Ukraine will conduct offensives in 2026, but not the kind that led to massive territorial gains in the short term, at least not in the year of 2026. Because this year is about weakening the Russian army to a point where larger operations become impossible for the Kremlin, and larger operations for Ukraine will become possible in the future. So in the end, the key question is whether Ukraine can sustain this strategy long enough. Can it continue to limit its own losses while pushing Russian losses at the breaking point? And could this eventually lead to a collapse at the front for the Russian Federation? Let me know all that in the comments. I will enjoy reading them. Otherwise, I will end the video here. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful. If that was the case, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And then take care, you all. I see you next time.